The argument that he was making was not a crazy argument that you honor secular people with an organ and watch them to honor God with an organ. It's just an instrument. Is there really anything wrong with that instrument? Shul. Obviously, the big question is an imitation of the non. So he used the argument that the Marik had, which is it's only it's only a problem if there's no reason for it. There's a very good reason to have an organ. They considered it very important, and it's not a breach of tzniut. It's not a breach of modesty. So it's not crazy. On the other hand, when you look at that article, you see that some of the things that he seemed to have been in favor of are, seem to me beyond the pale. Let's see what some of those things were. Remember what it was. Something really struck me about the article. Permitting kitnios. Not so crazy. I mean, it's true. It wasn't a gezerah from time of the Mishnah or the Talmud. It's from 1,000 years ago, but that's a big change. That was one thing he had changed. Adopted doing a circumcision. It's a Jewish doctor. I guess that could work. There was something else that was just strange. Maybe that was the things that are not, that are on the edge, I guess, although they seem pretty aggressive. Okay.
Now, one of the earlier things we talked about, which was a big deal for them, was the sermons in the vernacular. And so he doesn't meant is that issue so far gone for them, or it doesn't come up in this discussion?
That's a good question. Why isn't that something to mention? I think that's less of an issue because I think that Rabbi Samson Hirsch was doing that in Germany. I think the organ and there are some people that do things like robes, choir, sermon in the vernacular, but they won't have an organ in the shul at that time. You see that certainly with Rabbi Hirsch. So I think the sermon in the vernacular just isn't a big deal. I think that's part of it. I think what they really want is the organ. I mean, that it seems to mean a lot more than we can relate to. Okay, so let's see this one. He's a slightly more traditionalist. So he says, I was asked by Me'achai Adat Yeshurun, Hayoshvim B'Ramah, Lashiv Lahem Al Shel Tzibos. I'm not sure why he calls them Adas Yeshurun. That might not be a specific reference to a certain community. That could just be a honorific. Adat Yeshurun literally means the righteous congregation. So he says, Rishon Na. It says the first question that they asked me was, how many shuls there are in Verona? I don't know why that's a big question, but he says, okay, Verona has 1,000 nefashot l'nezah. It's 1,000 Jews. And it has 2 batei tefillah, 2 shuls. One is Ashkenaz and one is Sfarad. Okay. Shnia. The second question they asked was, in divrei hamusar hanikroim b'fi hamon am drashot. Here we go. Now, Marim B'lashon Ivri Oital. And then they asked of me, is divrei musar, now that could be the sermon, because remember, at this time, sermons were not necessarily for Shabbos. Is it in Hebrew or in Italian? So this is interesting, right? Why are early reformers, right, who are sort of quasi-Orthodox, or they're about to sort of, they're on the edge of Orthodoxy, trying to be Reformed, they're writing to a rabbi in Italy? That's very interesting. And they're asking him a question like, do you speak from the pulpit in Italian or in Hebrew? Right? So it makes total sense to me, right? They're sort of searching around. I want to know, like, where's the edge? Where's, right? In other words, to what extent is this just, the Chassam Sofers don't change anything? Or, are Jews really quite diverse? It's something we would do, I think. We right? Like you live in Brooklyn, you think that talking with a Sephardic accent means you're a reformer. That's crazy, right? There's diversity among Jews, so it's very interesting. They're writing to an Italian rabbi. East and West are very different, and that they're asking him that kind of question. Right? So he says, "Im ne'amarim b'lashon italki." If we say it in Italian, "L'man yishma l'man yilmedu hanashim ba'atav v'shara mashein mevinim lashon ivri." It's good to speak in Italian, he says, because then everybody understands, even the women, the children, and the rest of the people that don't speak Hebrew. Right? Obviously, Yiddish is not an option in Italy. They don't speak Yiddish. Amnam, even though it's not that far from Eastern. Amnam Mamarei Rabotenu Zal Umikrae Kodesh. Right? There's a. I think part of what's going on here is there's an attempt on these early reformers to link back up with what they see as the true Judaism. A Sephardic. I think that's part of the Sephardic issue. Is there's a sense that Sephardim, or in the past, that we have the sense totally, right, that we've become culturally Orthodox, that we've become, more insular, and that maybe Jews weren't always that way, and in fact that we assume they weren't. And so I think this is an attempt. This makes a lot of sense to me. It's an attempt to link back up with something more. In their own minds, something that's not only more liberal, but something that has more veracity. Okay, so he says, if you speak in Italian, they'll understand it. Amnam ma'amarei rabotenu zal mikra'ei kodesh asher meviim l'raya ne'amarim b'lashon ivri u'farshim varim otam b'lashon sach italki. So he says, but the words of the rabbis, now this sounds like maybe it's laning. Obviously, among some Sephardic Jews, they would translate into the Targum, into the Aramaic, and they still do that. Yemenites do that. But it sounds like here, when we say something, Mikrei Kodesh, in other words, he doesn't mean holidays, it means Mikra. I assume what he means here is when you quote from the Torah, when you read the Torah. So then we do that in Hebrew, but we explain it in Italian. O terem, o achar shenamra b'lashon ivri. Either before or after we do it in Hebrew. Now, it sounds a little bit like it was a maturkaman, like it was they laned, and maybe before or after they explain it in the vernacular. The third question: Im hatfila ne'emeret b'kol ram o b'lachash. So interesting, right? The questions that they ask this quite Orthodox rabbi from Verona. Like you can tell from the questions what they're trying to get at, and who they are, and where they're going. I have no idea if a rabbi in Verona in 1815 has any idea what reform is. I don't know. It's a German thing at this point. It's Berlin. Is the prayer, is tefillah, is the amidah, is it quietly or is it out loud? Right? They're fishing for a traditional community that does what they want to do. So he says, Ad Baruch Hu yesh echad hamitpalel mila b'mila lifnei hateva. Says until we get to Baruch Hu, there's a chazan that says everything out loud. Right? That's very much a Sephardic tradition. Baruch Hu, when they get to Baruch Hu, holech hashliach tzibur lifnei hateva. Then The person who's going to lead the congregation goes up there to the bima. Levush b'malbush hamiyuchad lo, and he wears a special garment for God. Meitakal, that the congregation has given him, muvdo mishara, different from the rest of the people. That's very interesting. They didn't ask that, but he says that, and that, of course, is something that did do. Mispalo Agol Yisrael, and then he prays till they get to the Amidah. Mispalo Balach Hashem Atzibur. He prays quietly the Amidah with the congregation. And then he repeats it out loud, exactly like we do. Very interesting. So on that, they really did not get the answer that they want. The answer that I think they're looking for is that they want to get rid of the silent Amidah, which even Rabbi Moshe that we saw had hedged about. Revius, the fourth question is, Im ha'ugav hanikra organo, if the organ, aser o mutter l'nagam beis tefillah, is it permitted or forbidden to use an organ? Shul, l'hanim hashirot v'tishbachot, to make the songs nicer that we're going to sing to God. Obviously, Italy is a place where there's a lot of Christianity. He says, Anochi haroeh asher she'ela hazot soveret al shlosha dinim v'horot. He says, I think this question is dependent on three issues. I'm going to explain them one by one. Rishona, the first one is, Im yesh lachosh lishtamesh b'kli nigun zeh mishum latad avodah zara shemishtamshim bo b'zman hazeh l'nagim l'tei avodah zara. So the first question is, because they use this for avodah zara, meaning it's referring to Christians, does that make it forbidden for us? Kahi, the mitzvah shekasab Rashi, as Rashi says in Parsha Shoftim, ve'afal pi shebetchila haya chadiva achshav sina yachashasu elachok la'avodah zara. As Rashi says in Shoftim, there were certain things that were permitted, and then they became forbidden because they became in use by the idolaters. We had that actually. I can't remember exactly what it was referring to. Something in Shoftim that's forbidden, because even though originally it had to do with Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, I think they brought sacrifice. Oh no, it was a matzeva, making a monolith, some kind of matzeva. So we see that Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov did do that. They definitely did that. But because later on it became used for idolatry, statue, therefore we don't do that. Shenis, so that's, he says, first question is, because it's used by the idolaters, by the Christians, does that make it? The second fundamental question underlying the answer is, mishum simcha b'zman, is that mishum korban beis mikdash? Are you allowed at all to use instruments? Because what about the destruction of the temple? Remember, we talked about that yesterday. As it says in Sota, Zimra Minal and Aser. How do we know that song, instruments is forbidden? Marukwa said, Al tismach Yisrael el gil ba'am. The Jewish people should not be happy, they're in exile. Which was Maram Shulchan Aruch, and as the says in Orach Chaim, the Shulchan Aruch, Chen gazu shel anagim b'kli shir v'chamin etzemer shmiya kol shel shir l'tzmei v'hem b'asel l'shem. After the destruction, you're not allowed to use instruments. I mean, obviously, it's changed. It says the third question this depends on is, do you have to worry that we're going to interrupt the davening and it will take away kavanah. And I'm going to answer all three of these. It's Dadei haheter near and yod. Interesting. He says right away, I'm going to answer it in terms of being lenient. I don't think it's an issue. As I'll explain, and God should help me answer it. So that's interesting. He already said it's going to be lenient. I have to do a little bit more research and figure out who he was. I started looking into him. His name is Rabbi Rikanati of Verona. And from what I could tell, he's considered quite a tradition. but his first name is Rabbi Yaakov Chai Rekanati from Pizarro. He wrote Piskei Rekanati. That was the book that he wrote. Must be Shul. And he was the rabbi in Baruch in the early 1800s. So here he already says, I'm gonna try and be lenient. Now, are they writing to a rabbi far away? Is it just because it's a different part of the world? Or do they also want to write to a rabbi? That's an interesting question, right? Do they want to write to a rabbi who's not impacted by the reform? In other words, he's in Italy, he's not in Germany. And maybe right. It's much easier to talk about these things before there's a reformation. It's much easier to permit these things before there's a movement that you have to worry about. I mean, I often say that there's certain things, that conversion is so difficult today in Orthodoxy because of the reform movement, because of the Gezer movement, because they did such easy conversions, so that we have to go to the opposite extreme. If that never existed, it would, sometimes we live in response to the world. And is that partly why they're writing? Let's see how. Okay. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
you.